What's up everyone? Welcome to a Tidal Gardens Coral Spotlight. If you're new to this channel, Tidal Gardens is a coral farm located in Copley, Ohio, and here we talk about all things coral reef tank related. One of the things that we do on this channel is to do a deep dive into a specific genus of coral, and that's what we're going to do here today. This video is all about Stylocoeniella. Right off the bat, I admit that I have no clue how to even pronounce this coral's name. It does have a common name, and that being thorn coral, but literally nobody calls it that. Although seldom used, I can see why they're called thorn coral because they often host these worm-like critters whose tubes extend out from the colony, making it look like a thorny ball. When I say that nobody calls it that, let's just say that I had to do a Google search for it, and it didn't exactly show up on the first page. So, we are left with a scientific name that's just hard to pronounce. The variations that I've heard revolve around how you pronounce that C-O-E in the middle. I call it Stylocoeniella, where the C-O-E is pronounced S-E-E as in like coelacanth, but I've also heard it pronounced Stylocoeniella. Anyway, pronunciation aside, let's talk about what these corals even are. In terms of taxonomy, their classification is every bit as oddball as their name. They are a member of the suborder, Astroceniana, and the family Astroceniidae. Which puts them in the category along with nearly nothing else. Anyhow, Stylocoeniella are an encrusting stony coral that has features similar to small polyp stony corals such as Montipora, but also some similarities to small polyp varieties of Goniopora, depending on how extended the polyps are. The Goniopora comparison, admittedly, is a bit of a stretch because the polyps of Stylocoeniella are a lot smaller, but I think that the shape looks similar. If Goniopora were an SPS, it would look like these guys. These corals are found throughout Indonesia and Australia. However, it's not frequently imported. When they initially hit the market, Stylocoeniella were quite rare, but luckily, they are a very easy coral to propagate and thus became more commercially available than one would expect given their spotty rate of import. Right now, there's only a handful of color morphs, but who knows? As more color variants are discovered, it may be as diverse as any other coral. That's a little bit of background on Stylocoeniella. Let's now talk about their care requirements, starting with lighting and placement. We primarily keep Stylocoeniella in low to medium light intensity here at Tidal Gardens. That translates to roughly 50 to 100 par. I really haven't tried keeping them in brighter light, but it might be possible to get brighter coloration under higher intensities. The main reason we don't have them in higher light, believe it or not, really just comes down to space issues here. They did well in one of our lower light systems and grew like crazy, so that's pretty much where they stayed. When in doubt, try lower lighting intensities until it's clear that the coral is stable before ramping it up. The lowest lighting we've grown this coral in was around 40 par. The coral seems adaptable, and if I were able to clear up some space for them in a brighter aquarium, we might try them there. If you have a colony of Stylocoeniella and want to experiment with higher light, remember that lighting that is too bright risks burning the coral, and it will happen quickly. So if you see the coral starting to turn lighter and bleach out, move it to a dimmer location sooner rather than later. As for placement, I would try to find a spot lower in the tank, possibly even under an overhang. I probably wouldn't place it on the top of the rock structure, assuming that it could handle the light at the top of your tank. I don't know how well that would work aesthetically, because this coral will stay flat to the rock, and oftentimes hobbyists are looking for a coral that's going to extend up towards the light structurally, so more like branching corals. One other thing about placement is to consider future growth. Stylocoeniella is a fast-growing coral that will spread quickly as it encrusts. You don't want to crowd it right away and have it grow into neighboring colonies of corals, for example. Alright, let's move on to water flow. Stylocoeniella appreciates low to medium flow. There are two things I'm looking to accomplish with flow for this coral. The first is to give it enough flow to keep it clean. Stylocoeniella is an encrusting coral, like we've mentioned, that can quickly spread onto the rocks or bottom glass. As a result, it can attract its fair share of detritus. Detritus buildup can cause the coral to die back where it collects. Providing elevated flow around the coral can prevent this accumulation. Even moderate flow can serve to keep the coral clean, but pay attention to any detritus accumulation and consider altering the flow in your tank to compensate. Detritus issues aside, one benefit to lower flow is that it gives the coral a chance to extend its polyps. In higher flow, I notice that the polyps remain tight against the body, and the whole colony resembles a Montipora or a Porites. Providing periodic moments of low flow is also beneficial for the purposes of feeding. Spot feeding Stylocoeniella is not something that a lot of hobbyists do, but I am all for it if people want to be proactive. They are not a particularly aggressive feeder, especially given its small polyp size, and if the colony only receives strong flow, it won't get a great opportunity to capture food. If you want to feed Stylocoeniella, what should you feed? Despite not being the most aggressive feeder in the world, there are a couple types of food that would work well for target feeding. These are amino acids and small zooplankton. Also, simply having fish present is a great nitrogen source for them. In other words, treat it as you would any other small polyp stony coral. Most hobbyists don't really go out of their way to spot feed, say, a Montipora. So directly feeding a coral like Stylocoeniella might be a little bit overboard. Ours have grown exceptionally fast without a lot of attention to feeding. Still, if you feel like going that extra mile with feeding corals, we can talk about that briefly. Starting with amino acids. They are simple organic compounds that play a major role in building proteins as well as serving other biological functions at the cellular level. There are about 20 different types, and most of them can be synthesized by the organism, but some can't and must be taken in by feeding. Those amino acids are termed essential amino acids, and they vary from species to species. For example, for humans, there's like 9 of them. Corals regularly take in available amino acids from the water column, so it's easy to provide them with an adequate source by broadcast feeding a basic amino acid solution. They're available from pretty much any manufacturer of commercially available reef supplements, and this might just be the easiest way to feed the stylos because as long as amino acids are in the water column, the corals will soak them up. Next up, small zooplankton includes organisms such as rotifers and cyclops plankton. There are kind of two kinds in the market, the frozen and the powdered. Both varieties do a great job of eliciting a feeding response from a wide range of corals. They are small enough that many small polyp stony corals can make a meal out of them. But you have to be careful because they're very nutrient dense and messy, which can elevate your nutrient levels. Last point on nutrition. Having fish in and around coral colonies tends to have a positive effect. Fish can provide a steady dose of nitrogen and phosphorus, which in small quantities is helpful for their nutritional needs. Although coral nutrition is important, there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. Most of the nutrition Stylocoeniella needs will come from lighting, and they'll absorb other nutrients directly from the water. If you're going to experiment with broadcast feeding or target feeding, try to start slowly with it and don't expect major changes overnight. Having some phosphate and nitrate in the water is beneficial, but overfeeding can cause some serious problems that can be hard to remedy. Let's talk a little bit more about chemistry. Since we had just talked about the potential problems associated with overfeeding, let's start with phosphate and nitrate. Phosphate and nitrate are great general measurements of water cleanliness. They're not the only ones, but most hobbyists are very familiar with these two parameters. They show up mainly in the food that we provide the tank, but also decaying plant and animal matter can also elevate their levels in the water. Generally, we shoot for about 5 to 10 parts per million nitrate and 0.05 to 0.1 parts per million phosphate with varying degrees of success, such as life in this hobby, right? If nitrate levels get too high, corals may react negatively by taking on drab coloration or, in extreme cases, dying back. If phosphate levels are too high, it may feed into an unwanted algae bloom or spur on the growth of other undesirable organisms that can stifle the growth of corals. For a short period, there was a push in the hobby to have near zero levels of nitrate and phosphate. This is mainly done through techniques such as carbon dosing or running GFO, which can aggressively bring those numbers down. Ultra low nutrient levels, though, come with their own set of issues. There is such a thing as too clean, and I would argue that the problems caused by near zero nutrient levels are much worse than those caused by an abundance of nitrate and phosphate. For starters, corals require some level of nitrate and phosphate available. When starved out, the corals first take on a shrunken, emaciated look, and then they start dying. After that, there's a risk for blooms of unwanted organisms such as brown dinoflagellates that thrive in ultra-low nutrient conditions. For Stylocoeniella specifically, I would rather see nitrate and phosphate levels on the high side than barely detectable because we've kept them in systems with very high nitrate with little to no difficulties. In some tanks, it was like 50 parts per million nitrate and 2.5 parts per million phosphate. Those figures are obviously super high, but that's just to give you an idea of how tolerant Stylocoeniella is when it comes to that high side nutrient level. Moving on from the nutrient parameters, let's consider the building block parameters: calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium. Because Stylocoeniella are stony corals, and fast-growing ones at that, these are the three major chemical parameters that are needed to support that skeletal growth rate. Starting first with calcium. Calcium is one of the major ions in saltwater. In the ocean, it hovers right around 425 parts per million. As a coral grows, calcium is absorbed from the water and used to form that skeleton. Alkalinity, on the other hand, not a particular ion, but rather a general figure of carbonate availability in the water. There's a bunch of compounds that make up alkalinity. Technically, it's the amount of acid required to lower the pH of salt water to the point that a bicarbonate ion turns into carbonic acid. So if you have more alkalinity, it can soak up more acid. Less alkalinity, and you have less buffering capacity, making the tank more susceptible to chemical changes. In practice, alkalinity tends to be the parameter that fluctuates the most. So, if you can only manage one test in your schedule, test for alkalinity. In natural seawater, the alkalinity of the water measures in at around 7 or 8 DKH, though these days most salt mixes mix up closer to about 8 or 9 DKH. Some hobbyists like to overload this parameter a little and keep their tanks around 10 or 11, and the thinking behind that is that elevated calcium and alkalinity in the water contributes to faster stony coral growth. Now, if you want to raise both calcium and alkalinity together, that can be a little bit tricky because of how they interact with one another. Addition of a calcium supplement might start a fall in alkalinity levels, and vice versa. If you're experimenting with this in your system, it's kind of normal, but at the same time, wild swings of calcium and wild swings of alkalinity, those are definitely not normal. So if you're experiencing dramatic swings, you may want to look at magnesium actually. Magnesium behaves similar to calcium. It too binds up carbonate ions, thus increasing the overall bioavailability of alkalinity in the water. In the ocean, magnesium sits at about 1350 parts per million. Okay, that should give you a little bit of background on the chemical parameters to keep an eye on. Remember though, that the growth rate of Stylocoeniella may make chemical stability more difficult to pin down, especially as this coral spreads and turns into a large colony. Fast-growing SPS colonies soak up calcium, alkalinity, magnesium, and trace elements at a much faster rate than their slower-growing relatives. At first, just regular water changes may be sufficient to keep up with the chemistry demands, but as the biomass increases, you may have to work in supplementation, such as kalkwasser drips, calcium reactors, 2-part dosing, 3-part dosing, or some combination of all of those things. When will this happen in your tank? Honestly, hard to tell, and that's why regular testing is recommended so frequently on this channel. It can really help with your decision-making process and also to avoid major pitfalls. Last point that I'm going to make about water chemistry is that stability is the goal. Even if 1 or 2 parameters are quote-unquote off a little bit, it's better for them to remain consistent at that level than for you to hurriedly try to change those values trying to hit a particular target. We've kept corals alive and thriving in less than ideal conditions because they were adjusted to them for a long period of time, and eventually we got the water chemistry back in line, but we did so over the course of several months. Also guys, there is such a thing as a bad test kit, and you might be getting inaccurate numbers. If I see a bad value, I like to confirm with a few different methods of testing before taking any drastic action. Okay guys, that just about does it for Stylocoeniella. So what type of tank is this best suited for? I can see this coral being used in a couple of different ways creatively. I can see it used as a ground cover in a high energy SPS dominated tank, as well as in a lower flow mixed reef with other stony corals. It's a very fast growing coral and can quickly cover rock, basically acting as a much more exotic replacement for encrusting corals such as, let's say, Montipora and Porites in like the highlight situations, or Pavona or Cyphastrea in the lower light situations. Either way, Stylocoeniella is an oddball coral, and it's a nice break from the norm. There are several monochromatic color variants, but more and more multicolored variants are popping up, such as the red and yellow burning banana variety, and we even came across one with a rainbow coloration that goes by Looney Tunes online. Anyway, that does it from here. Hopefully, this video is helpful for those looking to try them for the first time. If you'd like more information, or perhaps purchase Stylocoeniella for your home aquarium, I invite you to visit us at tidalgardens.com and see what we have in stock. We're always on the lookout for new and interesting color morphs to add to the collection. Until next time, happy reefing.